Great, thank you. Hello and welcome to Adapting the Jigsaw to Grow Online in a Hurry. While we get started with our presentation, if you would on your device, please text LSTERN to 37607, or you can go to pollev.com/lstern. We'll be asking you a few questions through the presentation, and that's a good way for us to keep tabs on your responses. So my name is Lauren deLaubell. I'm the Information Literacy Instruction Coordinator at SUNY Cortland.
And hi, I'm Jennifer Kronenbitter. I am the Director of Libraries. I've been here since, well, I've been the Director of Libraries since 2018.
So what are we hoping to get out of this session today? We want to teach you about the Jigsaw method in the context of professional development as opposed to instruction, to learn about how we developed online instruction last summer in the middle of a pandemic using the Jigsaw, and to think for a while about how you might consider implementing the Jigsaw at your own institution.
Thanks, Lauren. So yes, the online library instruction reboot. So in summer 2020, we anticipated that instruction would be virtual, at least through the whole academic year. And just a little bit of background, we have a very robust instruction program. We include subject instruction by liaison librarians. We have a long-standing partnership with the freshman experience and the composition programs, and those yield over 100 instruction sessions in a typical year. So given all that, how can we move this instruction online and do it well? And just keep in mind, we were all very new to teaching online.
So our question for you is how librarians at your own institutions prepare to teach. And I don't just mean what you did to teach online, but what was your preparation like last summer? So those directions are at the top for anyone who's just joined us. You can respond at pollev.com/lstern or text LSTERN to 37607. You might want to keep that up on your device as we do have a few questions throughout. So we had a lot of brainstorming. One person said thrown. I think a lot of people felt that way. Modules, I'm wondering if those were shared modules or if you used a modular approach to developing those. Maybe we can talk more at the end. Building tutorials, using the LMS, scurrying. That's a really good word. Yeah, it was a stressful time, definitely. Great, well, thank you for those responses. And now I'd like to know, how did you feel about that process? So click on the smiley face. So we had a couple of people feeling pretty good about it, but it looks mostly like neutral to maybe not feeling great. Okay, thanks for that feedback. We felt that way too.
Yeah, I similar to what everybody felt like here as well.
Yeah, especially going into it.
Yeah. So thinking about this, and talking with Lauren, how were we going to do this? And so Lauren came up with the structure to structure the work as a jigsaw. And so jigsaws are techniques used in classrooms where students work in a group to develop a shared expertise on a particular topic, and then they share their expertise with one another. And then you're reorganized into a new group that will benefit from all areas of expertise that were developed from this. So it seemed, this could really work with this project. And so some other reasons that this was decided we would use this jigsaw method was to develop this deep and broad expertise. So instead of everyone just having a superficial knowledge of a lot of content and technology, individuals had a chance to do a deeper dive into more narrow categories. So for instance, learning about interaction and small group work in online teaching instead of trying to learn everything there was to know about online pedagogy. The other thing is an ambitious scope. So it's an immense amount of work to do over the summer. And there's a lot of scholarship to try and cover if we wanted to use best practices to inform our online instruction. And then the group dynamics. So we are a large group. There's 13 when we embarked on this project. So smaller groups are more nimble and can do the work more quickly. And then lastly, there's the leadership opportunities. So there's opportunities for librarians if you use these team leaders to facilitate the groups or operationalize the groups. So here's our timeline. So we'll use summer 2020 to learn how to teach online. And looking at it, we thought, okay, there's 2 weeks for the pedagogy. And then initially I thought, okay, 2 weeks to learn the technology, but in reality, it actually took 3 weeks to do that. And 1 month to produce all the lesson plans and all the online learning materials.
So here's an actual photo of me from last summer. Breaking down the idea of learning to teach online into 3 chunks made it 3 different types of exploration, but even each of those categories was also pretty overwhelming. Trying to stay a few steps ahead of the group to lay the groundwork for them was pretty crazy. But I felt that it really set up the project for success to give them discrete timelines, to break it down into manageable chunks before we got going, and to do some of that groundwork ahead of time for them. So one example for that was that for the technology piece, I broke it down into 4 categories of technology after looking through lots of these lists of the top 100 ed tech things to categorize them into, okay, so what are these technologies doing? Breaking them into categories and then giving them a few ideas of maybe technologies they might want to start with. It doesn't mean they had to look at only those technologies, but just to seed the idea of looking at it. And then also to come up with a list of questions to consider when they were working with it. So how is the accessibility for the technology? Was it pretty user-friendly or was it difficult to use? Would it work with Blackboard, which is the system we were using? Would we be able to grade, etc.? This was, again, a lot of work. And for the first couple of steps of this project, I was working on that groundwork and my master plan with my string and my pieces of paper. So I wasn't working with the groups as much. They were functioning pretty independently when we first started. So this is our scope. First, we looked at the pedagogy of how we were going to teach online. And then we had 4 groups looking at each of these 4 aspects of pedagogy. Next, we looked at technology. So not just what technology exists out there, but what technology would support the pedagogy that we had just learned about. What things did we think would be really impactful on student learning? And then we did a remix of the groups and jigsawed and went into production for our 3 biggest instructional programs. Our freshman experience partnership, Core 101, where we teach usually 30 to 50 sections of that each year. Our freshman composition partnership, where we teach closer to 100 sessions each year, and then subject instruction, where I think we have usually a couple hundred sessions in a typical year. And then we also had the operational steps of the project, right? So for pedagogy, we formed the groups. I worked with Jennifer to identify who would be the team leaders at the beginning rather than leading up to the team. We had our own reasons for doing so. We set the task. The teams went off and did their research and made notes about what they were doing. Then we came back together to create shared documentation so that we could look back on all of the work we had been doing, to share the findings, and then reset. Switched into technology. The teams tested, researched, documented. Again, we shared out. Then we remixed before production. That's where that jigsaw image comes in. So people had explored different types of technology, different types of pedagogy, and they brought that more narrow but deeper expertise into the group. The rest of the group might be somewhat familiar with the ideas from that shared documentation and the presentation, but we had different people with different types of knowledge in the end when we went in to develop our projects. And for me, when we got to that step 3, this is when I was actually able to step out of my rat's nest of string and Post-it notes and start working more closely with the groups, which is the good stuff for me. I had the team leaders take over some of that project management work. So they were the ones facilitating the meetings, setting up the meetings, creating smaller timelines within their larger timeline for how they were going to make all that work happen. I attended meetings to see how the teams were doing. I met one-on-one with the team leaders to help troubleshoot things as needed. I was in close communication with Jennifer through the entire process as well. And I pitched in on the work, of course, wherever and whenever it was needed, doing a little bit of everything. So speaking of team leaders, I wanted to ask you what forms of mentorship you find to be most valuable. So this is another opportunity for Poll Everywhere. Wow, it's really flipping around a lot as we go.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll talk a little bit about kind of what Lauren did in this project. She mentored the team leaders to make sure that they felt confident and ultimately could be successful in what they were doing. They had a clearly defined project established for them, including the expectations for when they were doing the delivery of that. And then Lauren also checked in with the team leaders regularly. So those, and I see check-ins #1 right now. So she did a lot of check-ins, one-on-ones to see how the work was going. And then, you know, if they had any challenges that they were facing, either with the work itself or with the team itself too. She also provided some documentation, so ideas of pedagogy, essential questions to answer, and used a spreadsheet for assessment and reporting out the technology the groups had tried out. And then finally, she did some best practices, which comes up here as #2 here. So some key concepts of the project, as well as tips for managing the group. So time management, assigning action items, facilitation, just tips in general with it. So definitely, as we see here, a check-in is important for that type of mentoring in the group. Okay, so adventures and lessons learned from this. So results and takeaways. So we now had a shared toolkit for online teaching. There was purposeful technologies and there were learning objects to form the basis of their instruction for the fall 2020. And librarians felt confident now moving into this online instruction into the fall. So it also did some interpersonal connections. So feeling connected as a team during remote work and the social health crises of 2020 it was really important to have this dynamic there. And then the leadership takeaway with it, the opportunities. So the team leaders, they felt well prepared and they appreciated this opportunity to have some leadership experiences. And finally, most important at times is the change management. So everyone had buy-in, they felt comfortable with the changes, and the end product was a result of their own research and their work. So in general, going into the fall, people felt good about this. And I think Lauren will talk a little bit more about that later. Presentation. So future directions using this. It's an excellent way to reduce the workload when you use a huge project. So we would look at this if we were doing a huge project in the future. Not so much with a smaller group, but for a big project like this, there's a reduced workload for the individuals. They didn't have to go out on their own individually and learn about online instruction and develop their own materials. And the other thing would be timing. Timing is everything. So summer versus the semester. So we had time in people's work obligations in the summer to make this work. If during a large-scale summer project, make sure there aren't any competing projects of the same scale with it. And then balancing the teams. So when putting these teams together, these groups together, we mixed it up intentionally. And so we distributed part-time and full-time librarians throughout the groups. And we didn't want to give too many of the people who were service coordinators within the library too much of a workload because they had to prepare for the fall as well in their service areas. So mixing throughout the groups gave them an opportunity to contribute wherever they could at their level with the bandwidth that they had. So the outcome didn't rest entirely on these service coordinator shoulders. So looking at the future of this, I can see where we could have a project where other library staff from the other units could be involved, not just the faculty librarians with it.
So when we put all the pieces of our jigsaw together, what did we build in the end? One immediate outcome was this spreadsheet that we had made where we investigated lots of technology and asked the sort of questions that we would hope faculty would ask as well. It means that we had this ready-made list of recommendations that we could hand out. Faculty were interested in that, and it was shared by the Institute for College Teaching pretty early in the fall. For our freshman experience class, we ended up doing a virtual escape room that was inspired by a SUNYLA poster from last year by Kristen Sinar at Suffolk County Community College. We developed ours using Teams, and we had, I think, around 50 classes that ended up taking this. For our subject instruction, I used the best practices that we had learned from our research to make a template for LibGuides that looked very different from any LibGuides that we had created before. And this was used by the librarians as the shell for their courses. Our librarians ended up really deeply changing how they use LibGuides to teach, and several of our librarians actually presented on that last week or 2 weeks ago at another conference. We also had shared subject instruction modules. So for the subject instruction, we identified the common things that many of us teach and created modules that they could copy and then change as needed for their classes. So we weren't all creating a module about citation or all of us creating a module about source evaluation. We had one central thing which they could change or not and drop in pretty easily to their instruction. And although we did end up using LibGuides for quite a bit of our subject instruction, there is a way to copy that content and put it directly into Blackboard embedded, which many of our faculty took advantage of. So even though LibGuides was hosting our subject instruction, in part because it was a lot easier to copy it and move it over to different courses again, and for us to all share the information together, it was still meeting the students where they were in the course shell when the faculty was interested in putting it into their Blackboard course. For our freshman composition module, we create a Blackboard org for that each year, and this is a screenshot of our org. One thing we found was starting with a little intro video of yourself to have some instructor presence was a good idea for students, and they did often click on this and watch it. This was also another way to reach students using multiple formats. So in these videos, I'm talking and introducing myself, but I'm also giving them a verbal version of the instructions that are there. That red button at the bottom is a chat button. And here's another screenshot of one of the actual modules. We had a video and then some questions based on that video. Those questions were graded right away, and the students got feedback whether their response was correct or not. They could take these as many times as they wanted to. The conclusion of these modules were short answer, more metacognitive or reflective questions with really low stakes grading attached to them.
Okay, so feedback. So we wanted feedback from those involved. And in particular, we start with the student feedback. And Lauren surveyed our freshman composition students in the spring and in the fall to get their feedback. And we, a shout out to Project Outcome for the questions that we actually used for this survey. We also asked how long it took them to complete the modules, make sure the student workload was on target with what we had, because we had about 2 class periods. So from this slide, you can see that they reported that they used what they learned to complete their research papers, which is always something we're looking for. They did better in class, and they used the library resources and services. And the online modules, especially related to navigating Primo, was appreciated by the students.
And that's one question we have moving forward is, what do we want to take with us out of what we learned? Mm-hmm. So if we still have any online modules or online materials, which of those were most helpful for them to be online instead of face-to-face? And between the students saying that and some feedback that we've gotten from faculty and librarians, we're thinking that those more directional based things that we teach. Here's how our student portal looks. Here's where you click. Here's one search and some tips and tricks for things to click. It's also nice to have that set out for them as a module, because if it's in class and they tune out for a minute, they might miss some really important piece of information they should be getting, versus if we have that online for them, they can always go back to that pretty easily. So I also had some feedback from the librarians at the time that this was happening, as well as a survey that I recently put out to get some more formalized feedback from them as we prepared for this. And the big things that I heard from them were the things that we had observed as well. So they appreciated the collaborations that were happening, especially thinking about everyone being new to remote work. We were used to working in teams and committees and meeting up in rooms and talking, but things were different. We were all doing that from home with lots of distractions in our houses at a really difficult time. Librarians appreciated the opportunity to become leaders of their teams. And there was a lot of feedback about how efficient it was to undertake this project in this way. They also said that they found the final product to be really useful. It was something that everyone pitched in on creating, and we really did end up using everything that we had learned about. So diving in a little bit more deeply on these themes. So in terms of collaboration, the librarians appreciated having new partnerships. We did mix the librarians up, so it might be that people who didn't normally work together, didn't know each other that well yet, had the chance to. They also had the opportunity to develop and capitalize on expertise in different areas. So each person was researching a different thing, and their voice was important and heard when they all went together and were creating their product. Feedback on teams was also really positive. The librarians liked being able to chat with each other in an organized way between meetings to see how things were going. They could post a screenshot or say, hey, would you check out this module and give me feedback? And that could happen between meetings without having to be all together in person for it. For me, as more of a project manager role, it was really helpful to have them in discrete threads. We had one central team, but we had sub-threads. And for me to not have my inbox being flooded with 4 different groups having 4 different conversations was really, really important. Teams is something that we're definitely going to continue with as a library, even when remote work ends. It's been helpful to organize things and to communicate. The leaders appreciated being pre-selected instead of leaving it open. They had the stamp of approval, and that felt empowering for them to move forward. And they also appreciated the opportunity for professional growth. Many hands make light work. This was a huge project. So to divide and conquer made it feel really manageable, especially at a time when people were feeling really overwhelmed. But just in general, anytime you're embarking on a big project, if you can break it down into smaller chunks with a timeline, and this chunk is done now and this chunk is done then, that really helps with the work. It keeps it a lot more organized. And one librarian had a really interesting comment in that survey. They said that a lot of times when researching these sorts of best practices, you hit dead ends, things that don't work for your institution because of a variety of factors, money, expertise, size, etc. This format was nice because even if your branch hit a dead end, someone else would have found something that could be implemented. So that took the pressure off. Sometimes when you're doing this sort of research, as they said, when you need to apply it, there's a lot of pressure. You don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole and then not end up with a final product at the end. But if you were a part of a team that was all researching that particular aspect, you could do that deep dive. There wasn't as much pressure there. And then finally, they felt that we had a useful final product. We had that shared documentation to use about what technologies we might want to try, what pedagogy. We had templates. We had shared learning objects and modules that people could mix and match, and they could adapt. Technology was a mixed bag. We were super excited about the technology. The faculty initially were super excited about the technology. But when you're still using basically a 1 or 2 shot format, it's hard to get that buy-in to do something. So we found some great mind mapping software. This is something I've used successfully for a long time in person. Online, it didn't actually work as well to do. It was better to stick with technologies that the faculty was using in their class in a lot of cases. The technologies that went really well were using Poll Everywhere, which we're using today, using polling in the video conference software itself. Polling and chat were so important with synchronous sessions. Students didn't always want to speak up. Sometimes it was just a wall of black boxes, but they were more willing to participate in the chat and the polling, and it kept them inside the discussion and motivated and engaged. So my final thoughts, this is one of my favorite meme series from the pandemic. Someone took Frog and Toad Frog and Toad are friends and made it into pandemic memes. This one says, remember people, remember places, and Toad is huddled in bed and says no. So this is where we all were last summer. I am so impressed that everyone dove into this as deeply as they did in the middle of a pandemic. It was a huge professional load while we were all going through an intense social and emotional and mental health load of just existing last summer. So for me as a leader, it felt important not only that we got through this work, but that it felt manageable and okay while we were doing it together. And using the Jigsaw, everyone had an important role to play, but it was manageable.
So is the Jigsaw right for you? And I think first we have to ask you, does this picture scare you? This is what it's like putting it all together with it. So, you know, this scope of the project, we really think that this works great for a large project, but not so much a small project. You know, you need to have enough staff to do it. And, you know, with 13, it was great to have that amount. And the other thing, workload. So what's it look like during this time period? You know, would you carry out the project? Do staff have enough time to spend on this workload? And a big thing is, does your staff work well in groups? You know, I'm fortunate that my staff works excellent in groups, and this proved it as well. So, you know, you need to how you manage those group dynamics as well with it. So also, do you think your staff would buy into it? They have to be somewhat self-motivated to complete it. And again, like we said before, you also need to have a large enough staff to make this Jigsaw function. So again, we have 13, but if you just had 5, it might not work for your organization. And then the leadership opportunities. So, you know, using the team leaders was an ideal delegation. It benefited them, it benefited Lauren, and it benefited me to have that as well. And Lauren, you can kind of you spoke to some of the tasks that it unloaded on you with it.
Yeah, I was managing the big project with those timelines, but saying, okay, you have 2 weeks, look at student interactions in online courses. That's still a pretty big chunk, and you have 2 weeks to do it. So who does what? Do you all explore different sources? How often are you going to meet? Actually setting up the meetings, facilitating the meetings, all of that, I was able to say, okay, thanks. And they were able to pick that up and run with it. And that was their task. And they also appreciated being able to do that work because it wasn't necessarily part of their daily work usually. It's tough sometimes in libraries to get leadership opportunities when you aren't already in a coordinator position.
Yeah. Okay, so our question is, so what types of library projects do you think would be a good fit for this method?
And this is a brainstorm type of poll everywhere question. So if you see a response that you like, you can upvote it.
That's a good one, though. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And especially because we know that, diversity, equity, inclusion is on the forefront of all the SUNY libraries. Definitely. Nice.
Great. So I think those are all great ideas.
Great. Yeah.
And then a final one with content creation. That's great. Thank you. I'm going to steal your ideas. So now that you've learned a bit more about using a jigsaw in a professional development context, are you willing to try it? This might not be a good fit for every library. I mean, it's a good point for us because we do have the benefit of having a larger staff. It makes a lot of sense for us to break things up in this way. So if because of staffing reasons, the jigsaw itself doesn't make sense, looking at the pros of the jigsaw, you might think of how you could further adapt it to make sense in your context. So we're pretty evenly split, but it's between yes and maybe. That's great.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So here's our credits, and now we have time for questions from you. Feel free to unmute yourself. And Jennifer, if you have any in the chat.
I will keep track of the chat for you.
Great, thank you.
So far, chat is empty, but I have a question. What inspired you to do Jigsaw? Like, where did you run across it?
I have used the jigsaw in teaching before to do station activities in my classes.
Some of us might need to start with like the 10-piece kids puzzle and work our way up.
So you get to the 500 or 1,000 piece.
Exactly. Limit yourself to 10 sticky notes. Okay, there is a question in chat. Let me read it out for you. Are you planning to apply it to future projects? If so, which ones?
Yeah, I mean, I do anticipate applying it to future projects. One thing I want to include more of the staff with it. Anything that I like the idea that because we are doing a lot with diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is a great thing. We can move forward with that because we have a lot of different service areas that will be involved with that. So that is something. And then, of course, we do need to look at a redesign of the content of our website. I've kind of been putting that off a little bit during this time period, but we do need to do that. So it would be great because it involves, again, so many different areas with that too. And Lauren, I don't know. I mean, if we have another instructional push or change, I think that would be awesome to use this again.
Hopefully not too soon. And I agree with Jennifer. I would really love to see this with staff so that we have, again, people that don't necessarily work together closely, working together and on the same footing, and everyone contributing their different expertise to the project. We do that anyways, but I think that the Jigsaw really forefronts that and supports that.
We have another question. I may have missed this. Was this a library-wide initiative or a departmental initiative?
This is, I would say, more of a departmental initiative because it involved just the librarians who either taught subject instruction, core, composition. So it's just instructional librarians.
Mm-hmm. And in another situation, we would have gladly included one or more instructional designers in this as well, since we also have those in the library, but they were a tad busy helping the whole campus figure out how to teach online.
Sarah Wiseman would like to know how many librarians are in that departmental group.
We started with 13 and then we ended up with 12.
And I should state that some of the librarians in that group, their sole job is not instruction. So that's kind of where we went to the kind of service coordinators. So we have technical services, archives, discovery services in that mix there.
Again, feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a question or type it into chat. Lisa Dinkel, in response to the departmental initiative, said you had good ideas.
Thanks.
When you pre-assigned those team leaders, did you try to match people who had certain capabilities, or was it more about people who needed a chance to lead?
Well, I would say some of it is needed opportunities to lead with it. And then also keeping in mind, like the group that I just talked about, the kind of coordinators of the different services, they were also doing a lot of other things to get ready for the fall semester. So it was really just trying to match, give people that experience with it. And I'd say, yeah, I mean, I look at the librarians as they definitely have a lot of now technical expertise. So, so, I don't know, Lauren, there's definitely with some of the stuff that, especially with the core, I would say tour and stuff, we looked to people who had maybe a little bit different technical expertise with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, as Jennifer said, it was balancing workload and providing opportunities. So instead of going to people that had shown leadership qualities and already had leadership roles, they were very fully loaded in those leadership roles already. So we took this as an opportunity to have others who didn't always have as much of a leadership role in our programs to be able to take that chance to get their foot in the door and do that.
That's a great model for growing leaders. So still no question. Oh, wait, there's one. Is there a ceiling for the size of groups that this method could work for, or is it scalable to larger groups? This is from Corey Allender.
I think it depends on the project, but I do think that if your groups got too large, then the dynamic of them doing this independent work might suffer. So if you had a really large group of people, 30, 40, 50, I think it might start to be less effective. We had groups of 4 and 5, I believe, for the most part, which was a good number. And I feel like that's what I've done in instruction most of the time. Maybe I'm hitting a mental ceiling of 30 because that's the biggest class I've done it with. But that's a good question. If you did have a large group with multiple departments, you could always do it by having representatives from those different departments, where even if not all of them were involved with that research and development, they would then bring the information back. And that way, maybe their home group could be the department they normally work with. So using Jennifer's example of diversity, equity, and inclusion, if this goes into all of your different departments, maybe you have 2 or 3 people from each of those departments if you're a really big library, and then they come back and they do that work in their department that's relevant to their department. But those representatives wouldn't only be involved with just their piece of it, they would be mixing and matching to give information and perspective to all of the things that are happening.
So feel free to type in chat or unmute yourself if you have a question. Until then, I'm going to keep asking mine. So something's. The next question I actually had was a little bit about the project management piece. You said at one point you transferred that to the team leads. Was that done via Teams with tasks, or how did that transfer occur? Because that seems to be.
It was done through one-on-one conversations and Word documents. So saying, here is our timeline, here's a list of essential questions, here's some technologies, here's some best practices for what you might do as a team leader, making sure that in group meetings that you're facilitating the discussion, making sure that you're hearing from everyone. So all of that was offloading that work. And they had their deadlines and they just ran with it as needed to make sure that the work was getting done. I was checking in with them, but they became responsible for their team's product.
Tricky thing. Excellent. What do you think was the most surprising thing that came out from using this jigsaw? And I don't mean technically, but like, what was the most interesting thing that was found through those deep dives, in your opinion?
I had a sense going into it of some of the things that we heard back about positively, breaking down the work into chunks, having people work together, knowing from experience that working together as 13 people is not a great way to accomplish a small task. It tends to make it take longer. It's a good final product, but it takes longer. We didn't have lots of time. The thing that was surprising was that although I knew that the leadership opportunities would be appreciated, I've heard about it a few times since, that was a valuable learning experience for them, that dipping their toes into project management in a small way was really helpful for people who had never done that before. So the impact of that on them was something that I had underestimated.
Was there a surprising instruction technique that came to light as part of this research?
I think it was surprising that the buy-in on technology was even less than we had anticipated. We knew that we needed to pick meaningful technology that was user-friendly, but there was still that barrier there, even more so than using that same technology in a classroom face-to-face. Using that same technology and trying to teach them how to do it in an asynchronous video conference was more difficult. I don't know if that's because of the platform or because of COVID mind and everything else going on with people, that there was just less bandwidth to juggle multiple balls at the same time. So that was a little bit surprising. One thing that we didn't use as often as we had hoped, but which we had really positive experiences with, was Flipgrid. So that's a free technology where students respond using a selfie video to a video prompt, and it has a social media type interface. So it was almost self-explanatory. They could record a short video on their phone, they could add text to it or an emoji or something silly to it. And those that did use Flipgrid, they had really good student buy-in from it. And one professor really liked using it in his class because when he was in class synchronously, it was just a bunch of black screens. So he didn't feel like he knew his students and he hadn't seen half of them. So for him to have Flipgrids and to be able to look at the videos of the students, he felt like he could learn more who they were and have a better sense of them that he wasn't getting from teaching online.
That the teams did? That was called Flipgrid? Interesting. Were there any accessibility issues?
Not that we noted, no.
Awesome. We still have a few minutes for questions if anyone else would like to ask a question. Again, you can type in chat or feel free to unmute yourself. I've already pulled up Flipgrid. I'm interested to see what it's. Jennifer, did you have a surprising insight?
Well, I think, so it was when we all went remote, obviously it was very difficult. And like Lauren has alluded to, we were used to working together and we worked together a lot and, face to face. And so, as we all got up to speed on how to use, Teams or WebEx or, whatever format, that was interesting. And I was pleased at the end of this because, it seemed even some of people, including myself, had learned the technology and could feel comfortable utilizing it, because we weren't using anything like this before. We didn't have that. So, having librarians that felt confident in moving into the fall was, for me, was awesome with it. And I think the other thing too, looking at how those librarians who hadn't had the leadership opportunities really excelled with it, so that was just great to see that as well.
Sounds like it was an exciting time for everyone.
Yeah, right.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
Back to your faces, right?
And in the end, I think, we'll take some of this, Lauren said, we'll take some of this and utilize it, even though for the most part, I think we're all anticipating that there's some kind of return to face-to-face instruction in the fall. At least that's what we're all hopeful for. But, there's the takeaways from this that we can use.
Are you going to do sort of a jigsaw method to see how to hybridize it for the fall?
That has been done through a combination of talking to students, talking to faculty, talking in larger meetings of all of the librarians, and then a smaller steering committee that focuses just on library instruction. We are going to mostly be focusing on in-person instruction rather than hybrid. That's how our courses are set up as of right now for fall. But this idea of the virtual handout that several of our librarians have been using is one that we're really thinking about continuing with. We all have that experience of handing out the piece of paper and maybe they work on it during class, maybe they don't, and then they leave it on the table. So a link might be a good way to communicate that to them. And it also frees you up in terms of what handout means. It doesn't have to be static. It can include videos or tutorials or interactives if it's virtual.
That's a great point. I'm really curious to see if you will present again next year to talk about the way the questions were answered differently, your assessment questions were answered differently between the quick put together Jigsaw online and then back to a more traditional in person. That sounds like your assessment activity has been strong and I hope will continue to be so because I'm interested.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, well, if we have no more questions, we can go ahead and end a little bit early. Everybody can have a slightly longer break before the annual meeting, if that's what you're interested in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to the presenters, Lauren and Jennifer from Cortland. This has been fascinating. I know I've learned a lot. Corey, quite a few thank yous are popping up in the chat now. So great presentation. Thank you. The interaction was unique. Appreciated that.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.